An ordinary day turned into something no one could imagine. Watch till the end. You won't believe what happens. Write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. It was a calm Sunday afternoon in the suburbs of Los Angeles. The sun had started its slow descent toward the horizon, and its golden light stretched long shadows across the neighborhood streets. The air was warm, but not stifling, the kind of air that carried the scent of trimmed grass and the faint sweetness of flowers from nearby yards. Most families were inside, relaxing after a late lunch or preparing for the week ahead, and the street itself felt almost deserted. Only the soft flutter of branches and the occasional bark of a distant dog disturbed the silence. Walking along the sidewalk was 10-year-old Emily, the niece of Jean-Claude Van Damme. She had just left her weekend art class at the community center, a routine she loved, and clutched her sketchpad tightly against her chest. Her small fingers pressed into the cover as if protecting the drawings she had worked on all afternoon. In her other hand, she carried a shiny green apple she had saved as a treat for later. Her steps were steady, her face calm, her eyes thoughtful. She was not a child who made noise for the sake of it. Emily wasn't laughing, shouting, or skipping like some other kids might have been at that age. She was quiet, focused, content. Just a little girl heading home, 2 short blocks away from the safety of her house. Then the stillness cracked. The low growl of an engine rolled into her ears. Tires crunched against the edge of the curb. A black and white police cruiser slowed to a crawl right beside her, moving at her pace. Emily stopped mid-step, her heart suddenly heavy in her chest. The window slid down with a faint hum, and the officer inside leaned toward her. His sunglasses slipped slightly down the bridge of his nose, revealing eyes that looked sharp, not kind. "Where you headed, sweetheart?" His voice wasn't gentle. It carried an edge, a tone that sounded more like suspicion than care. Emily raised her hand timidly and pointed straight down the street. "My house is right there. I'm just going home." The officer's expression hardened. His tone dropped lower, sharper. "ID?" Emily blinked, confused. She clutched her sketchpad tighter. I'm 10 years old," she said softly. "I don't have any ID." The man muttered something under his breath and shoved the car door open with a sudden motion. The slam of the door, shutting behind him, echoed down the empty street. His boots hit the pavement heavily as he stepped out. Emily's stomach tightened. Her legs wanted to move, to run, but her body froze. His shadow stretched on across her small figure as he walked toward her, step after step. "Where are your parents?" His voice rose, carrying authority but also aggression. Emily swallowed hard. She tried to stay polite, remembering what her mother and her uncle had always told her: "Stay calm, stay respectful." "They're at home," she said. "I just left art class." She took a small step back, hoping he would accept her answer and return to his car. Instead, his hand shot out. He grabbed her wrist roughly. The sketch pad slipped from her arm and smacked against the concrete. The apple rolled from her hand, bouncing until it settled against the gutter. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, pulling her closer. Emily gasped, panic surging through her body. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't do anything." She tried to twist away, but his grip only tightened. And then it happened. With a sudden, cruel twist of his hand, there was a sickening crack. Pain exploded up her arm, sharp and unbearable. Emily screamed. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the sidewalk, clutching her arm that now bent at an unnatural angle. Her face was wet with tears, her voice broken as sobs poured out of her chest. Above her, the officer loomed. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He muttered under his breath, words she couldn't fully hear through the haze of pain. She felt smaller than ever, swallowed by his shadow, her body trembling. But through the panic, through the blur of tears, Emily remembered what her uncle had taught her. Jean-Claude Van Damme had insisted that she always carry her phone, and, more importantly, he had shown her how to press and hold one button that would call him instantly, even if the screen was locked. "In an emergency," he had said, "you call me. No matter what." Her fingers, shaking and slick with sweat, gripped the phone still in her free hand. She pressed the button, holding it until she heard the faint click of a connection. The line opened. Miles away, in his home, Jean-Claude Van Damme answered his phone with the ease of someone used to sudden calls. But what came through wasn't Emily's cheerful voice. It was her sobs, the harsh bark of a man's voice, and then, clear and unmistakable, the crack of breaking bone. For a moment, his heart seemed to stop. Silence filled his chest. Then adrenaline roared through him like fire. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He had heard enough. Jean-Claude grabbed his keys, pulled on his jacket, and sprinted to his car. His movements were sharp, automatic. The phone was still in his hand, the line still open, and every sound poured into his ear. His niece's pain, the officer's voice, the chaos of the moment. Back on the sidewalk, Emily sobbed harder. "Please, I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice cracking. Her small frame shook violently. She pressed the phone tighter to her ear. "Uncle, he hurt me." Jean-Claude's grip tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, weaving through traffic, every nerve in his body focused on one goal: get into her. The officer crouched, as if preparing to pull handcuffs from his belt. His shadow fell over Emily's crumpled form. He muttered, "That's what happens when you don't listen." Emily whimpered, tears streaking her face, her arm bent at a wrong angle. The phone trembled in her hand. The line remained open, every word traveling to her uncle's ear. And somewhere, not far enough away, the faint sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. The officer looked up, startled. His eyes darted back to the girl. Annoyance flickered across his face. He muttered something she couldn't understand, then quickly turned, retreating to his cruiser. The door slammed, the engine roared, and within seconds the vehicle pulled away, leaving Emily broken and sobbing on the sidewalk. The sketch pad lay open on the ground, pages fluttering in the breeze. The apple sat forgotten in the gutter. Emily pressed the phone against her cheek, her breaths ragged, her words weak. "It hurts," she whispered, though her uncle had already heard enough. Moments later, an ambulance screeched to a halt nearby. A passerby, horrified by what they had seen, had called for help. Paramedics rushed to her side. One knelt close, his voice gentle but shaken. "She's just a kid," he muttered to his partner, disbelief thick in his tone. They carefully lifted Emily, noting the unnatural bend of her arm, the tears still running down her cheeks. Even as they placed her on the stretcher, her hand clung desperately to the phone. The line remained open, the name glowing on the screen. Uncle Jean-Claude. 30 minutes away, Jean-Claude Van Damme's car cut through traffic like a blade. His focus was absolute. Every sound from the call replayed in his head. The cruel snap, his niece's scream, the officer's cold words. His chest burned with rage, but beneath it was something stronger: resolve. He had taught her to call in an emergency. She had done it, and now it was his turn. By the time Emily was being wheeled into the emergency room, nurses and doctors surrounding her, Jean-Claude was only miles away, and in his mind, one thought thundered louder than the engine of his car. Whoever had hurt his niece was about to learn that there were consequences for every action. The sound in his ear was unbearable. Every sob, every faint gasp of pain, every cruel word the officer had thrown at Emily still pulsed through the phone line. Jean-Claude Van Damme gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He had heard many things in his life, cheers from arenas, orders shouted on movie sets, even the chaos of real fights, but never something that broke him in this way. The fragile cry of his niece was different. It was personal. The highway blurred before him. Cars swerved aside as he pressed down on the accelerator, weaving through traffic with the precision of a man who had spent decades training his body and mind to react under pressure. His focus was absolute. Reach Emily. Every second felt like an eternity. In the background, the call continued. He heard other voices now, hurried, urgent. A paramedic's tone reached his ears. Her arm's broken. Be careful, lift her gently. Jean-Claude's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He imagined his niece lying on the ground, pale and trembling, clinging to her phone, refusing to let go because that single connection gave her strength. The officer who had hurt her was already gone. Jean-Claude knew that much. He could hear it in the hurried words of the responders, in the confusion of the scene. The coward had retreated the moment sirens approached, abandoning the child he had just brutalized. That image burned in Jean-Claude's mind, an officer fleeing the scene while his victim cried for help. It was proof of guilt and proof of cowardice. When the hospital came into view, he didn't slow. He swerved into the parking lot, tires screeching, his car halting in a sudden jolt. He leapt out, the phone still in his hand, the call still active, and stormed through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Nurses moved quickly. Doctors shouted instructions. The sharp smell of antiseptic filled the air. Jean-Claude's eyes darted around until they landed on the stretcher being wheeled down the hall. Emily's face was pale, her cheeks stained with tears, her small arm wrapped awkwardly in a temporary brace. The sight pierced him. He moved forward instantly, but the nurses raised their hands. "Sir, you can't—" "She's my niece," Jean-Claude said, his voice like stone. Something in his tone silenced them. They stepped aside. He reached her side, kneeling beside the stretcher, his hand gently brushing the hair from her forehead. Her eyes opened weakly, meeting his, and tears spilled again. "Uncle," her voice cracked, "he hurt me." "I know," he whispered, his own throat tight. He pressed her hand gently. "I'm here now." "You're safe," Emily sobbed softly, but she didn't let go of the phone. Even as the nurses wheeled her into a room, she kept it clutched in her trembling fingers, the screen still glowing with his name. Jean-Claude stayed by her side as the doctors examined her, as they confirmed the fracture and began setting her arm. Every word they spoke only deepened the fire in his chest. Clean break, severe force, unnecessary trauma. He watched as they carefully fitted her arm into a temporary cast, her small frame trembling at every touch. He had seen injuries before. He had suffered them himself, but watching her endure it was unbearable. When the doctors stepped back, satisfied with the immediate care, he leaned close again. Emily's eyes fluttered open. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I just wanted to go home." Jean-Claude pressed his forehead gently against hers. "I know, Emily. I know, none of this is your fault." But inside, his rage grew sharper. He had to know who the man was. He had to know how someone wearing a badge could lay a hand on a child. By evening, the pieces began to come together. Through contacts he trusted, Jean-Claude learned the officer's name, Ray Dunning. And with it came more. Complaints, buried reports, whispers of misconduct. Parents had spoken out before, teachers had filed concerns, but every time, nothing had been done. His file wasn't just troubling, it was damning. It painted a picture of a man who should never have been allowed near the public, let alone with authority. Jean-Claude read the details, his chest tight with fury. This was no mistake. It was a pattern. a predator hiding behind a uniform. Meanwhile, Emily's phone had done more than connect her to her uncle. One of the nurses, quietly horrified by what she had witnessed, copied the call's audio and shared it with a journalist who happened to be at the hospital for another assignment. The journalist listened, pale-faced, then passed it on. By nightfall, the recording was already online. The sound of Emily's terrified pleas, the officer's cold, commanding tone, and then the snap. That single, unmistakable sound cut through every feed, every platform. People who listened felt their stomachs twist. Comments began pouring in. How could this happen? She's just a child. He needs to be stopped. Jean-Claude sat at Emily's bedside, her small hand in his, while the storm outside grew louder. His niece finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her face still damp from tears. He brushed the hair back from her forehead, whispering softly, "You're safe now. He'll never touch you again." But the words were not enough, not for him. He knew Emily had been brave. Even through pain, even as her bone broke, she had remembered what he taught her. She had pressed that button. She had called. She had reached him. Now it was his turn to show the same courage. The audio was spreading. The world was beginning to react. But Jean-Claude knew better than anyone. Systems protect their own. If he didn't act, if he didn't keep pushing, this could be buried like every complaint before. He stood at the window of the hospital room, watching the glow of streetlights flicker against the night. Somewhere out there, the man who hurt his niece was sleeping, as if nothing had happened. But Jean-Claude Van Damme wasn't going to let this end quietly. And as the noise outside swelled, protesters gathering, reporters circling, the city restless, he knew that what had begun as one call was about to become something much larger. By dawn, the recording had spread far beyond the hospital walls. What had begun as a single file passed between hands was now echoing across the internet. The frightened cries of Emily, the harsh bark of an officer's commands, and that awful, unmistakable crack were played on phones, televisions, and laptops in thousands of homes. Parents covered their mouths in horror, activists raised their voices online, and strangers who had never heard Emily's name before were now demanding justice for her. Outside the hospital, a small group of protesters had gathered during the night. By morning, they had doubled, then tripled. Hand-painted signs rose into the air. Protect kids, not abusers. Justice for Emily. Their chants rolled across the parking lot, loud enough to be heard in the corridors of the hospital itself. Reporters swarmed, their cameras pointed at the entrance, waiting for a glimpse of Jean-Claude Van Damme, the man whose niece had become the center of a storm. Inside, Jean-Claude stood by Emily's bed. Her arm was now in a sturdier cast, her face still pale but calmer after a night of medicine and rest. Nurses had decorated her cast with small drawings, flowers, and words of encouragement. "You're brave. Stay strong. Justice is coming." Emily smiled weakly when she looked at them, but her eyes still held the shadow of fear. Jean-Claude bent low beside her, his hand resting on hers. "You did everything right, Emily," he whispered. "You called me. You stayed strong. I promise you, he will not escape this." Emily nodded slightly, her lips trembling. "He laughed when I told him who you were." The words pierced Jean-Claude like a knife. That laugh meant something more than cruelty. It meant arrogance. It meant the officer believed no one could touch him, not even a man like Jean-Claude Van Damme. That belief would be his downfall. By noon, the pressure outside had reached a boiling point. Television crews reported live from the sidewalks. The audio was played again and again on news stations, each time followed by stunned silence in the studios. Commentators spoke with disbelief. Legal experts warned of systemic failures, and activists pointed out that Emily was not the first child hurt by authority, only the first whose cries had been impossible to ignore. Jean-Claude knew the moment had come. If he remained silent, the system would close ranks, bury the truth as it had before. He had to step forward. He left the hospital briefly that afternoon, stepping into the glare of cameras and chants. The crowd erupted when they saw him, phones lifted into the air, reporters shouted questions all at once, but Jean-Claude did not wave or smile. His face was set in calm determination. When he spoke, his voice cut through the noise. "A man with a badge hurt my niece," he said, each word sharp. "That badge will not protect him anymore." The crowd roared. Chants of "Justice, justice," filled the air. Jean-Claude turned and walked back inside without another word. He had no need to shout. His promise had been made. That evening, the hospital was surrounded by candlelight vigils. Families held photos of loved ones who had faced similar injustices, their voices blending with Emily's story until it was no longer just about her, but about countless others. Jean-Claude stood at the window, watching, his resolve solidifying. Later that night, sitting alone in his car, he spotted Ray Dunning through the window of a small diner on the corner of Main and 6th. The man sat slouched in his booth, scrolling through his phone, a smirk still clinging to his face as if the world outside didn't matter. He barked at the waitress for more coffee, his arrogance as strong as ever. Jean-Claude waited across the street, watching. His fist could end it in seconds. He knew that. But fists weren't what this moment required. Violence would not be justice. It would not expose the truth. The strike he needed to make had to echo far louder than any punch he had ever thrown. After 15 minutes, he opened the car door and stepped into the night. His boots clicked against the pavement as he crossed the street. When the bell above the diner door jingled, conversation stopped. Heads turned. The weight of his presence filled the room. Ray looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. He was ready to dismiss whoever dared approach him. But when he recognized the man standing at his booth, the color drained from his face. "Can I help you?" Ray muttered, his voice unsteady. Jean-Claude didn't answer. Instead, he placed his phone on the table and tapped the screen. The diner filled with sound. The sound of Emily's cries, the officer's harsh voice, and the snap that silenced the room. Forks froze midair. The waitress gasped. Every eye turned toward the booth. Ray's smirk vanished. His hands twitched nervously. "Where did you get that?" he hissed. Jean-Claude's eyes didn't waver. His voice was low, sharp as steel. "You know who that little girl is? She's my niece. And I am Jean-Claude Van Damme." Gasps rippled across the diner. People whispered his name, phones lifted higher, recording every word, every second. Ray tried to muster a sneer. "You threatening me?" Jean-Claude leaned closer, his gaze unshakable. "If I were threatening you, you'd already be on the floor." He slid a folded napkin across the table. Written on it were the words, "Room 6, General Hospital, 10 years old, broken arm, audio, witnesses, internal affairs." Ray stared at it, his hands trembling. Around him, the room buzzed with quiet outrage, strangers capturing his shame from every angle. Jean-Claude straightened, his final words calm but cutting. "By the time the world is done with you, the badge you abuse will be worth less than that napkin." He turned and walked out. The tension broke like a dam. The waitress rushed to the back, already calling someone to report what she had witnessed. Diners whispered furiously, replaying the audio they had just heard, repeating the words they would never forget. Outside, chants still echoed through the streets. Videos from the diner began circulating within hours, spliced together with the original recording from Emily's phone. Hashtags surged. $, justice for Emily. $, no more silence. By midnight, Ray Dunning's name was trending worldwide alongside a single word, resign. And as Jean-Claude returned to the hospital, sitting once more by Emily's bedside, he knew the confrontation had struck its mark. The fight was far from over, but the world was now watching. By the next morning, the city was restless. News vans parked outside police precincts, reporters stood live in front of cameras, and protesters filled the sidewalks. The diner video had combined with the audio from Emily's phone, and together they created an unstoppable force. Strangers across the country had heard her cries. They had seen Ray Dunning's pale, trembling face as Jean-Claude confronted him. The story had become impossible to bury. Ray tried to fight back. He deleted his accounts, avoided his neighbors, and made desperate phone calls, but the momentum was too strong. The department, which had shielded him for years, began to distance itself. Officials issued statements of deep concern, insisting an investigation was underway. For once, the words rang hollow. The public wasn't satisfied. Under mounting pressure, the inevitable happened. That afternoon, Ray Dunning was arrested outside his own home. Cameras captured the moment, officers reading him his rights as his hands were cuffed behind his back. Neighbors filmed from their porches, their voices mixing disbelief and satisfaction. He didn't shout. He didn't resist. His shoulders slumped, his face gray. For a man who had once laughed in the face of a child's honesty, there was no laughter left. Inside the hospital, Jean-Claude and Emily watched the footage on a mounted television. The image of Ray being pressed against the hood of his own car filled the screen. Emily's small hand gripped her uncle's tightly. "Is it over?" she whispered. Jean-Claude looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "It's just beginning," he answered softly, "but you'll never face him again." The next stage began quickly. Within weeks, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Every seat was taken, every hallway outside lined with people desperate to witness the proceedings. Victims of past abuses sat quietly in the gallery, their eyes heavy with memory. Reporters crowded the back, pens and cameras ready. Jean-Claude sat in the front row beside Emily, her healing arm held gently in a brace, her blue dress crisp but simple. His presence was calm, unshaken. Across the aisle sat Ray Dunning, thinner, gaunt, his arrogance gone. He kept his eyes down, refusing to meet the gazes fixed upon him. The judge entered, and silence fell. The jury took their places, 12 faces carrying the weight of a city's attention. The prosecutor began steadily, declaring the state's intent to prove that Officer Ray Dunning had knowingly and violently assaulted a minor, failed to report the incident, and attempted to evade justice. The first evidence presented was the audio recording. The courtroom froze as Emily's frightened voice echoed from the speakers. "Please, I didn't do anything." Then came the harsh bark of Ray's commands, and then the snap, the sound that made the entire room flinch. A juror covered her mouth, another closed his eyes. Even the judge's expression tightened. Emily lowered her head, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. When the recording ended, the silence was overwhelming. Photographs followed. X-rays of Emily's fractured arm, images of the bruises along her wrist. Doctors testified about the nature of the injury, explaining how much force it required and how irregular it was for a child to be left on the curb without care. Paramedics described their shock when a police car had dropped the girl and driven away without a word. Each testimony added weight to the evidence, pressing heavier on the defendant's table. Then came Jean-Claude's turn. When he stepped onto the stand, every eye in the room turned. His presence carried quiet authority, not from celebrity but from sincerity. He spoke without raising his voice, his accent distinct but his words sharp. He told the jury how the emergency call had reached him, how he had heard everything in real time, how he had arrived to find his niece trembling in pain. When the defense suggested he acted from uncontrolled rage during his diner confrontation, he met the attorney's gaze steadily. "I didn't act out of rage," he said, his voice unwavering. "I acted because he thought he could hurt a child and walk away. I wanted the world to see he couldn't." The objection that followed was overruled. His testimony stood. One by one, others stepped forward. Parents who had filed complaints in the past ignored. Teachers who had noticed bruises but had been dismissed. Even a retired lieutenant who admitted under oath that misconduct reports had often been buried to protect the department's image. The pattern became undeniable. Then came the most difficult moment. Emily herself took the stand. Guided gently by her mother, she looked small in the large chair, but when she spoke, her voice carried, trembling but clear. She described how the officer had stopped her, asked for ID, how she had told him her name and her uncle's name, hoping it would help. She told them how he laughed, and then how he grabbed her and broke her arm. When asked if she had anything more to share, she reached into her bag and pulled out a drawing she had made during recovery. It showed a little girl with her arm in a cast, standing tall before a crowd with the words written underneath, "I'm stronger now." The courtroom rose in silence. No one applauded, but the respect was palpable. Even the jurors lowered their heads. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the atmosphere was heavy. The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she read the verdict. Guilty of aggravated assault on a minor. Guilty of abuse of authority. Guilty of attempted evasion of justice. Ray Dunning sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table, his hands clenched. The judge ordered him taken into custody immediately. This time there was no escape, no shield, no silence. Officers stepped forward, cuffed him, and led him away. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Cheers, chants, tears of relief. Signs bearing Emily's name and the word "justice" waved high in the air. Reporters shouted questions, but Jean-Claude didn't stop to speak. He walked down the courthouse steps with Emily beside him, her small hand in his. A reporter called out, "What happens now?" Jean-Claude paused for only a moment, turning his head slightly. "Now," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we build something that doesn't need my name to be heard." Then he guided Emily into the waiting car. The officer had fallen, but Jean-Claude knew the fight was not finished. The system that had allowed Ray to exist still stood, and the next battle would not be against a single man, but against the silence that had protected him for so long. The trial had ended, but the echoes of it refused to fade. Across the nation, people replayed the recording, shared the diner video, and discussed the verdict. For many, it was the first time they had seen a man in uniform, not shielded by silence or bureaucracy. For others, it was the spark they had been waiting for, the proof that their own ignored stories might one day be heard. Outside the courthouse, the chants of justice for Emily still lingered in the air. But inside the quiet hospital room where Emily continued her recovery, the world felt smaller, calmer. Her cast was covered now with messages written by nurses, doctors, even strangers who had sent notes for her. "Stay brave. You are not alone. A fighter, just like your uncle." She traced the words with her good hand, her face soft with gratitude. Jean-Claude sat by her bedside, watching as she sketched with her free hand on a fresh piece of paper. Her lines were uneven, but her focus was steady. When he leaned closer, he saw what she was drawing, a little girl standing with a crowd behind her, her arm in a cast, her head held high, Across the top, she had written, "I'm stronger now." He felt his chest tighten. That strength, born out of pain, was something he had never wanted her to need. Yet here she was, proven that even at 10 years old, she had resilience most adults lacked. But Jean-Claude also knew something else. This couldn't end with one man in handcuffs. It couldn't stop at a single guilty verdict. Too many stories had been buried. Too many families silenced. What had happened to Emily was terrible, but it had exposed something larger. An entire system that had allowed men like Ray Dunnan to walk freely for too long. In the days that followed, Jean-Claude began making calls. Lawyers who had watched the trial offered their support. Journalists who had once reported on silenced complaints reached out with files. Activists, civil rights groups, even retired officers who were tired of corruption, all wanted to be part of something greater. Together, they created what became known as the SHIELD Initiative. Its purpose was simple but powerful: to shine light where silence had ruled, to defend those who could not defend themselves, to ensure no child or family would have to stand alone again. Offices were opened in cities across states, staffed by volunteers, attorneys, investigators, and counselors. What had begun as one child's desperate call had become the foundation of a movement. Emily, though still young, became its symbol. Her drawings were printed on posters and shared online. Her words, "I'm stronger now," appeared on banners carried by marchers in cities she had never even visited. People who had never met her spoke of her bravery as if it belonged to them, as if her voice gave strength to theirs. One afternoon, Jean-Claude took her to a small gathering outside the hospital. The crowd parted as they stepped forward. Candles flickered, songs rose, and chants quieted. Emily looked nervous at first, clutching her uncle's hand, but when someone asked if she wanted to speak, she nodded. Her voice was small but clear. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to go home. But when he hurt me, I wasn't alone. My uncle was there, and now all of you are here. Thank you for helping me be strong." The crowd erupted with cheers, not because her words were long or polished, but because they were true. Jean-Claude looked down at her, pride etched into his features. He had fought countless battles in his life, on screens, in arenas, and training halls, but none had ever mattered more than this. And unlike those fights, this one would not end when the bell rang. It would continue day after day, until change was no longer a dream, but a reality. That night, as Emily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Jean-Claude stood by the window. Outside, news vans still idled, protesters still chanted, and the city still buzzed with debate. The fight ahead would be difficult. The system would resist. But he knew one thing with certainty: they were no longer fighting alone. The movement had been born out of a single act of cruelty, but it had grown into something powerful, unstoppable. Emily's voice, carried through a phone call on a quiet Sunday, had become the spark for a fire that stretched far beyond Los Angeles. Jean-Claude whispered to himself as he looked at his niece, safe at last. This is only the beginning. And in the silence of the room, with the weight of the past behind them and the promise of change ahead, the story of Emily and her uncle closed, not as an ending, but as the first chapter of a larger fight for justice. You've seen how quickly everything can change. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.